Welcome back to the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. Many of us have been sitting with some devastating local news. The kind of tragedy that makes us question our humanity, our capacity to care for one another. Last week, 2 children, ages 2 and 9, died while sleeping in a car at the Hollywood Casino parking structure in Detroit. Police believe they froze to death, and they were with their mother, grandmother, and siblings. During a press conference, Mayor Mike Duggan said the mother had called the city 3 times asking for help. But, he said, neither she nor anyone from the city followed up, and the case wasn't escalated to an emergency. On the night that the children died, there were shelter beds available, the mayor said, and the city is investigating what happened.
In Michigan, more than 35,000 students experienced homelessness last school year. That's according to state data. But research suggests those numbers are much higher. And that's for a few reasons. For one, students experiencing homelessness sometimes don't know about the resources schools can provide. Another issue is that families don't trust revealing these challenges to staff. And when parents do share this info, staff don't always follow through. This tragedy, the deaths of 2 young children, has spurred some strong reactions. People want someone to blame. And whether there's culpability remains a question. But what we do know is that homelessness and the pain and tragedy that stem from it reflect a much bigger failure, a systemic one. So what are the cracks in the system and how can they be repaired? Our next guest has some ideas. Eric Hufnagel leads the Michigan Coalition Against Homelessness. Eric, welcome to the program.
Hi, good to be here.
So Eric, first, could you give us a sense of the problem of homelessness in Michigan?
Yeah, sure. When we talk about homelessness in Michigan, we're talking people per year on average over the last.
Eric, you just cut out. Could you say that again for me?
Okay, can you hear me now?
I can. Live radio. We love it.
Here we go. Technology can kill us, right? So when we talk about homelessness in the state of Michigan, we're looking at about 30,000 people over the last few years on average that have experienced homelessness. And it's something that is not unique to any specific region or city. It's something that we see across the entire state as an issue.
Now, your organization tries to address homelessness from a holistic standpoint, and we're going to get into those different areas. But first, as briefly as you can, what does that mean?
Well, as an organization, we don't provide direct services, but we work with organizations that are involved in providing services at the local level. And so what we're doing as an organization is thinking in terms of how can we elevate the work that folks are doing? How can we provide tools and training to support the work to make sure that people have the ability and are pursuing best practices? But at the same time, we're also looking at advocacy work at the state and federal level. When we think about what kind of changes could take place with respect to funding to support the work that's being done, also what kind of regulatory changes could be made that would help assist some of the work that's being done. But also we think in terms of what are the upstream issues that contribute to homelessness. So one of those as a prime example that I think everybody can identify with is the ever increased rate of rent around the state. It's something that's a very significant issue impacting just hundreds and thousands of families across the state.
Right. We know that housing affordability is a huge factor in contributing to homelessness. I want to talk about policies on the books because I realize you focus quite a bit on that. You mentioned that advocacy work and enacting policies and the need to do that to help people who are experiencing homelessness. Are there local and state policies that are making a dent right now in the problem of homelessness?
Well, certainly there are policies that are helping. The question is how quickly can we have change take place to address the real issues. We can talk about trying to put additional services in place, but if we cannot catch up with the lack of affordable housing that we are addressing, it's going to be a continual problem. So when we think about that, we're talking about how can you have additional dollars that are incentives for developers to target lower income housing. But then also we talk to communities about what can you do with respect to zoning that may allow greater numbers of units to be built. What kind of incentives can you provide to developers to bring them into your community to pursue that kind of housing? So that, that's just a couple of examples there where you can have incentives provided and or free up access to development by changing some of your zoning expectations.
So, housing policies are most crucial right now in addressing homelessness. You're listening to the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. We're speaking with Eric Huffnagel. He leads the Michigan Coalition Against Homelessness. Now, Eric, let's go to resource coordination. Later in the program, we'll hear from two people providing services and resources to people experiencing homelessness in Detroit. Both have told us that there's not enough connectivity among providers trying to help. So how do we change that?
Well, I can't speak to Detroit specifically, but I can tell you that across the state, you do have different ways that you have what's called coordinated entry being addressed. Coordinated entry, just to explain that concept, is the idea that you identify a lead agency or a number of agencies within a particular community that are responsible for doing intakes, identifying people's needs, their eligibility, and trying to match them with services that are available in that community. Prior to that, you ended up having people just calling potentially dozens of organizations to find out what kind of resources were available and what eligibility there was, et cetera, et cetera. It was a very difficult process. Now there's an attempt to really streamline it by having those lead agencies as kind of the conduit for filtering in those requests and trying to match people up for services. So again, they vary, but it's a far better system than what we have had in the past.
And Eric, the third factor you focus on, you talked about it just a little bit, that holistic approach or even the community approach. Can you talk about why it's so challenging to get people more engaged on this issue, especially in a communal way?
I guess I would start off by saying that homelessness is complicated. Um, Quite often, people like to simplify issues, and with homelessness, quite often people will think, well, it's decisions that people make. And that it's that judgment that comes into play. But quite honestly, we're talking about a myriad of issues that singularly or collectively could be contributing to homelessness. So you could be talking about a domestic violence issue. You could talk about somebody losing their job. You could talk about a health crisis that somebody encounters, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the list goes on. And so when you're thinking about addressing the issues that are some of the underpinnings when we look at what contributes to homelessness, we need to be addressing a wide array of issues. And sometimes it's difficult for the public, I think, to understand that it's such a broad array of issues that need to be addressed. To find solutions makes it hard for people really to wrap their heads around that and think about how they can be engaged in making a difference, other than going to a shelter and trying to volunteer, or going to a soup kitchen and helping to serve food to folks. Those are the kinds of things that people think about, but the opportunities to get engaged in meaningful ways and trying to make some systemic changes are harder for them to identify and understand where they can jump in.
And Eric, the belief that people did something wrong to become homeless, or there's something that happened, this idea that, it was their fault. How do we change hearts and minds around the topic of homelessness in our country?
Well, for me, it's really explaining to people what the data tells us. And it's unfortunate, but again, we like that easy answer. We like to have our minds explain things to us in the simplest of terms. So it's easy for us to judge and say, well, this must have happened because of this. Nobody wants to be homeless. Okay, that's not a choice that somebody would actively make because it's something they want. It's something that they are pushed into because of their circumstances. So how can we get people to understand what those underpinnings are and think in terms of what are the contributing factors and how we as citizens in this state can elevate the priorities and communicate in our communities what we believe those priorities are. And that's kind of that disconnect, but it's looking at data. We have an annual data report that we help to promote that focuses on information about those individuals who present themselves as homeless during the year, who are getting services, what the outcomes are, et cetera. And we can look at the demographics. And the demographics would be, I think, quite an eye-opener for much of the public if they really looked demographically at what percentage of individuals have a mental health issue, how many people have a substance use disorder, how many people experience domestic violence, et cetera, et cetera. The numbers are there and show us the wide range of issues that do contribute to homelessness. So people need to understand it more to be able to, again, elevate it as a priority in their community.
And it's, one thing that we've been covering here, of course, is following along with the homelessness population here in the city of Detroit and resources and ways to help. But one thing that I've been hearing from the community groups is the lack of data, and that data is needed to really help folks. So, Eric, before we let you go, as briefly as you can, what are the most impactful ways people can get involved and help address the problem of homelessness right now?
Well, certainly there is data, and you have local agencies that do collect information, what's called the Homeless Management Information System. That's something that our organization coordinates on a statewide basis. So data is there. Individual agencies can look at their data and see what their outcomes are, and the city of Detroit partners can, through their continuum of care, look and see what the data is as well. So it is there, it's being looked at. But it's hard to make changes within that system. It's not a simple solution, again, because homelessness is complicated. But I would say as individuals, if you are interested in being a part of the solutions, you should reach out to an organization that does provide services of some kind. Okay, it doesn't have to be a shelter.
Hey, Eric, I'm so sorry I have to cut you off, but we will make sure that we get this information in there, and we will make sure we have it up on our web post as well. Eric Huffnagel leads the Michigan Coalition Against Homelessness. Eric, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Coming up, we'll look at how more people are making a dent in homelessness in Detroit. Stay with us. This is the Metro. Welcome back to the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. And we've been talking about the holes in the social safety net that can lead to tragedies like 2 children who apparently froze to death in the Hollywood Casino parking lot last week. But we also want to continue emphasizing how people are trying to close the gaps and help those experiencing homelessness, especially when it's dangerously cold outside like right now.
That brings us to Veronica Scott. She struggled with poverty and homelessness as a kid. She remembers driving around with her mother, getting sent in circles from one caseworker in Detroit to another in Pontiac. Years later, she took a class at the College for Creative Studies called Designing to Fill a Need. And it led her to her work today. That is helping people experiencing homelessness. Her organization, Empowerment Plan, employs people living in shelters. They manufacture coats made from sleeping bags that they distribute to folks in need. That includes people in Detroit, across the nation, and in dozens of other countries. But it's not just about creating jobs for vulnerable people or the coats they're making for folks in need. We recently spoke with Veronica Scott about the Empowerment Plan, and we started the conversation asking her what her organization does and how it got started.
We are a nonprofit based here in Detroit, and we're focused on generational homelessness. And that looks like, for us, hiring individuals from shelters across the city. We have incredible partners from Coalition on Temporary Shelter, Alternatives for Girls, Detroit Rescue Mission Ministries, to name a few. We have over a dozen that we hire from. And then we employ people that are either experiencing or have a history of experiencing homelessness to manufacture these coats that turn into sleeping bags. So we produce them on site in our facility on the east side. And we're producing about 12,000 coats this year that are going to go out across the entire U.S. and 20 other countries. And I think that's just been, it's wild to think that a class project.
Yes. Say that
12
number again. How many coats?
Just for this year alone, we're doing about 12,000. And since we began, we've done close to 90,000 coats. And that's been globally, all 7 continents. So I think for us, that has also just been word of mouth. That's just been following the need. So if somebody reaches out to us, whether it's one individual that says, hey, I see this person every day on my way to work, I want to do something, all the way to organizations that reach thousands of people in their respective cities and states. So it's been an incredible journey.
Can you talk a little bit about how Empowerment Plan has grown? Because where it's at right now is it's quite impressive to think about. And as you've said, this is to meet a rising need, but it started as a much smaller little seed.
Yes. Oh, yeah. So it's funny to think about the early days of me being a college student, having no idea what I was doing, running around with what looked like a giant trash bag, which was a prototype of the coat at the time. I had to learn how to sew from my mother. It was like the worst experience of her life. Oh, it was rough. She had to sit there with me as I was trying to sew. I tried also to make it a tent in the beginning, just so you know, you don't have to start with something perfect. Sure. The tent part never worked out. I wanted to use orange construction fencing, and it immediately collapsed. And when it collapsed, I was like, oh, look, a sleeping bag. So, amazing design inspiration. That's really, the creative process right there. And those early days of working and spending time at NSO. So NSO has been one of our longstanding partners. It was at the Toonami Center and loved just their warming center. And the need was so great at that time. There's about 20,000 people counted homeless when I started back in 2010. And then, we had over 70,000 abandoned buildings. And so the warming center served a very serious need because there's only a few shelters around.
And when you say NSO, you're talking about the Neighborhood Service Organization. Okay,
yes.
Thank you.
Love them.
Linda
oh my
Little.
God. Yeah, they're just such, and we've been, again, they were the first place I started quote unquote volunteering, but spending time at that warming center because there was only a handful of shelters that could maybe house 1,000 people at the time. That was it. Now, we've grown since then. Shelters are so important. And when we were looking at it, there were so many people outside that warming center that were just waiting to get in the cold. So 100, 200 people were there in the building. Hundreds would be waiting outside. And so I wanted to create something that if a shelter bed was not available to you, if there wasn't, which is a very real thing happening today as it was then, if a shelter bed's not around and you have to go from one place to another just to stay alive, how can we prevent frostbite? How can we help you in case you are sleeping in an abandoned building? Sure. How can we be there for you and be there for the resource teams that are out there doing great work to hopefully get you there so you can get a bed. Just help you survive until you can get into the system, into the shelter, into housing. And that's really our goal.
Veronica, I realize this work is personal for you. You faced some struggles growing up that have really helped to inform your trajectory. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, love to. I always like talking about my own personal experience growing up in homelessness and poverty because I really love to dispel the myth of what homelessness looks like because it doesn't look like anything.
Right.
It's not a defining characteristic. You can't see it slapped across someone's face that they had been or had experienced homelessness. Some of the most surprising people I've ever met, had to sleep in their car, had to go through a lot of struggles. And so for me, personally growing up in that situation with my parents, they're both really talented, intelligent individuals. Like I think that needs to be said that there are a lot of people that are just trapped, that have no way of getting out. And so growing up in that situation and then starting Empowerment Plan, I just loved doing the work because I could see that there were a lot of people like my parents out there. And personally, I just remember how everyone treated me and my siblings as if we were worthless extensions of our parents. That because my parents struggled with addiction, mental health, employment, everything, people would just look at us like by default, because we were their children, we were bound to have the same life. And you feel like you're digging yourself out of a hole. And so for us, we really focus on parents for that reason. You want, like, every parent we've ever talked to is like, why are you doing this? Why are you working so hard and going from shelter to shelter and pushing so hard every day? And they're like, it's my kids. And so I know what that's like. I know how hard my parents worked at that. And still, the struggle is very real, and still kind of balanced with that. So for me, it's creating an opportunity I wish my own family had been given. Like if you had 2 years just to pause, focus on all of the things, not just income, which is so important, but housing, childcare, transportation, mental health, food security, all those things. If you just had time to figure some of those things out without being sent across the city, would you be in a better place?
Veronica, I want to get into something you mentioned a little bit earlier, but you said generational homelessness, and I had never heard that. I've never heard that before until today. So if you can just get into that a little bit more and just talk about how it connects to you and your personal experiences growing up, and how that you did feel like you were kind of born in a hole there.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think there's also a lot of people that I know I've personally worked with over the years that the shelter is the only place that they've experienced growing up. I know from talking to incredible executive directors of other organizations, other shelters, where they'll see generations of the same family. They're like, I know her mom, she used to stay here, I know her daughter, I know her grandbabies now. And so I think that's, and yes, we'll see a number of like how many people that shelter served or how many people had to utilize those beds. But it was really surprising to me. It's like how many of those individuals have been kind of year over year needed that, but also generation after generation needed it. And when you're growing up in it, it's so hard to get, you're starting off in a hole that you have to dig yourself out of. They did a study in Chicago that said, this was 10 years ago, it hasn't gotten much better, that a single woman needed to go to over 72 different organizations to get out of poverty. That's a single woman, let alone imagine if you had 3 kids. You're taking the bus, you're trying to get places.
Impossible.
It's impossible. And so for me, there are so many great childcare, early education, amazing programs for kids that are in schools, outside of school. But we know if that kid goes home to instability and trauma and things of that nature, the work can't be as successful. And so I think that's what I think about, was like I had great teachers, but then I still went home to what I went home to. And how can we help parents create that home or be there for their kids when they get home from school, or have the capacity to know that they have food, they have the rent check paid for, they have all of these things. Those are the big things, just like to take that oppressive fear off your shoulders for a little, that constant terror of like what's going to happen next. How can we help that family? So that's what we mean by generational, is like by working with parents, and by working with individuals that have dependents and family that they take care of, how is that impacting a community? Because we know impacting a mom has a very powerful impact in the community.
Veronica Scott is the founder of Empowerment Plan, and we're talking about providing warmth and opportunity to people experiencing homelessness. This is The Metro on WDET-FM. I'm Tia Graham here with Robin Vincent. But Veronica, just listening to you talk about that a little bit and thinking about, food on the table or rent or bills being paid, the kids also absorb so much of that stress and anxiety as well. Kids are at home thinking, I don't know if I'm going to have electricity when I get home because the bill wasn't paid. And I know it wasn't paid. Even at the youngest 6-7 years old, the kids are absorbing that anxiety and that strife from their parents. So I would love to just tap into that a little bit if you can, just what it does to the kids in that environment.
My mom, when I asked her about this, I've talked with her a lot, she told me, she's like, we owned nothing and it owned us. It takes over everything. It takes over, even as a kid, and like my mom like would sew amazing stuffed animals for me for the holidays and things like that. Like they would work to cover that. And I know so many parents are out there doing that, doing their best so that their kids don't feel it, but they can see it on your face. They can see it on their parents. They can see the stress. They can feel it. And I think what I hear from a lot of people is like, I barely felt it, but I knew it was there, especially as a kid that grew up in poverty. And so I think that's really, to give credit that the struggle, you're doing a great job. It is incredibly hard. And one of the things that we've seen is just like, how can we help support parents that go into schools, work with the teachers? Because when I was going through it, I had teachers that I remember getting an award that was least likely to show up on time because my parents struggled. It was like, just that awareness around like that has changed. Thank goodness.
So counterproductive.
Thank goodness that has changed. But like having empathy for where these kids are coming from, what they're dealing with at home. And then I had teachers that were just like the most game-changing people ever that saw something in me. So just remember to be that game-changing person. It doesn't take much, just like a smile, high five,
that's right.
Not doing the shame-based anything.
That's
like,
right. Veronica, you've been talking about some of the services, the actions that would have made an impact in helping you and your family when you all were struggling with housing and poverty. Could you talk more about the missing links in the system and how you're trying to fill those gaps?
Yeah, that's something I'm deeply passionate about. I think for me, there's a lot of great organizations, especially in Detroit. We have a ton of nonprofits. We have a ton of good nonprofits that serve a lot of people. And I think one of the things that's always tough is that we're almost told to be pitted against each other, that we're competing, which is so counterintuitive. We're serving the same people. We're trying to help these individuals move on, but we're told that like, oh, if you get this money, then I can't get this money, and then that we're competing for these dollars.
I've heard that.
When the reality is, it's like if we can collectively move the needle, like we don't, as Empowerment Plan, don't exist if shelters don't exist. We can't. We need them as partners, and so that's where we hire people. That's how we help move the needle. And so we work together. We have like 15 different nonprofit partners that we work with just for hiring. Detroit at Work, like I said, all these amazing organizations. And one of the challenges I've seen is that competitiveness also means you're not collaborating. And one of the things that I want to see as a sector is like, how can we collaborate more? How can we share data? How can we share information so that we don't have to re-traumatize a person every time they step in our door? Okay, you told them your story yesterday, and it was a horrible one. I'm really sorry. Can you tell that to me again so I can get the same information? It's really hard to do that, to ask somebody to keep on saying and like have to start over at every new place. So at Empowerment Plan, we like to bring the nonprofits on site. So when you're working with us, you're spending 60% of the time making the coats, and then the other 40% of paid time is dedicated to wraparound services. So we bring on Pro Literacy Detroit to run our GED programming. We run, financial health and wellness with Community Financial Credit Union. We bring on these different entities like Digital Essentials with Journey. So they come on site and run the program instead of expecting somebody to be like, all right, you worked 9 to 5, and then now I'm going to ask you to go to a night GED class that may be free, but how are you getting there? Where are the kids going? It's not really free.
Our conversation about homelessness with Veronica Scott, the founder of the Empowerment Plan, continues after this break.
This is The Metro on WDET. Stay with us.
Welcome back to the Metro on 1019 WDET, Detroit's NPR station. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. It's been cold out, dangerously cold. While many of us are able to retreat inside a warm home, shelter and heat are not guaranteed for everyone. And there are many reasons people experience homelessness or housing insecurity. Advocates say the biggest ones are a lack of affordable housing and a low income.
The scarcity of affordable housing is compounded by other issues vulnerable people face, like a lack of strong social safety net. In other words, if you don't have people to fall back on during financial hardship, it can mean missing rent and facing an eviction. That's when the problems snowball. That eviction makes it harder to find another place to live. Other factors that contribute to homelessness include health problems and domestic violence.
Chad Audi is the president of the Detroit Rescue Mission Ministries, where he oversees multiple shelters and food banks across the city and offers services to people in need. He joined our conversation with Veronica Scott from the Empowerment Plan. We want to get a better sense of what you're seeing right now. How many people across your shelters are you housing at the moment?
We are housing across the emergency shelters only about 750 people every single night. But throughout all our organization, we have about 2,500 people every single night today.
2,500 people every single night. Can you talk a little bit about the demographics? Tell us what groups of folks are accessing your shelters the most.
Actually, we have them all, from cradle all the way to senior citizens, unfortunately. So the bulk of it is women and children. And we have actually, we are right now the only provider for single men in the city of Detroit.
That's one of my questions, actually, Chad, to you was about that specific thing there, men in shelters, and the importance that there is a space for men in shelters, especially with you all.
Yeah, most providers, they closed their shelters for men. We became the only provider for men right now in the city of Detroit, simply because it is very costly and there is a lot of money available for an organization to be able to provide for this particular population. And then for fundraising factors, usually a picture for women and children brings more attention to when you see a single man. And also we need to note that there is a single man, but also we are a provider of single men with children, because people tend to forget that sometimes there is certain men who actually have the custody of their children, and they are homeless. So, but we don't talk about it much because usually people view men as more solid or more independent, but the facts are not truly the same as the reality.
Yes, Chad, and we will definitely get more into that as we continue on with the segment. But Chad, let's look more deeply at the folks you see in the shelters. What are some of the circumstances that they face that lead them to the shelter? Can you talk about some of those misconceptions there?
It varies. Now, first of all, people, they have a different perspective of homeless. The panhandler is not a homeless, and people portray a person who stand in the corner of a streets or on the highway, that these are homeless. Those are panhandlers, and we need to differentiate between the homeless and the panhandler. Homeless people are usually people, like you said earlier, could be domestic violence victim, could be lost their job. Like me, if I lose my job for 2 or 3 weeks, I'll become homeless. There is people who have mental health issues, and there's people with substance abuse issues that cause them to become homeless. So there is a lot of underlying factor that cause the person to become homeless. It doesn't just happen overnight. And in the city of Detroit, we have about 7,000 homeless people right now, of which there's more than 1,150 who do not have beds. And this is the bigger problem that we are facing today. But for the population that we're serving, we see all kinds. We see people who there's different level of service that everyone needs. The people who have mental health issues, they need more extra services because they will become functional and be able to work if they get their medication on time. So they need somebody to be with them at all time versus somebody who just they're working homeless. This is another. So you got working homeless who actually go during the day and work, and they need a place to come. People are making minimum wage or even making $15 an hour, and with 3 kids, they can't afford being in any house in the metro area. So therefore, they come to our shelters.
Mm-hmm. And this is the Metro on WDET. We're talking about the problem of homelessness today. We have Chad Audie from Detroit Rescue Mission Ministries and Veronica Scott from Empowerment Plan to help us better understand the many ways homelessness manifests here in Detroit and Metro Detroit.
Veronica Scott, I'd like to point out you hire folks from the same shelters that Chad Audie oversees to work for you at Empowerment Plan. We'll get into that a little bit more, what that looks like. But first, something we talked about earlier, and for those who are just tuning in, I want to go back to it. I realize this work, it's personal for you. Can you remind listeners the circumstances you faced growing up that made it hard for you and your family to keep stable housing?
Yeah, I personally grew up I have lived experience. So I grew up in a situation of homelessness and poverty with my parents. They struggled with mental health, addiction, unemployment, and we spent a lot of time bouncing around, looking at a lot of the evictions that you're talking about and a lot of what Chad is talking about. And, we don't exist without our shelter partners. And, there are times when my family utilized those services too. So I can say how important they are.
Mm. And that also brings to mind something we discussed that there are, and something you've pointed out already, Chad, that there are a lot of different faces of homelessness and housing insecurity. That seems really important to point out. And I realize that you mentioned, Chad, that panhandlers you might not necessarily think of as you don't believe are necessarily homeless, but we know there are people living on the streets with all their belongings. I mean, I those are the folks I was mentioning to Tia that I interact with, and they're killing time during the day until they can get into the shelter sometimes.
Yes. When I'm talking about the panhandlers not necessarily being homeless, because there is a lot. If you go to certain areas in the city of Detroit or the border of Detroit, you will see the same people standing every day, and every time they change the message. Those individuals not necessarily homeless. They go there. This is a part of the job. Does that mean, though, that you shouldn't be helping them or they're not good people or whatever? I'm not to judge them, but I can say that this is not the representation of the homeless. Homeless population are like me and everybody else. They're good people going through some hard times that cause them not to have a place to live. And this is how they become homeless. So then we would need to provide them with the service that they need, protecting their dignity and respect at all time. So when they lose their place where to have a good meal and a place to lay their head and feel comfortable, this is what we do for them, because we want them to be able to recharge and go back and become independent. So we are that. Shelter is just a small portion of the service that we provide to get them back on their feet, and it shouldn't be a long stay usually in the shelter. We strive to make sure that people go out of the shelter, and this is why it's very important to have the collaboration with Veronica and her organization, because without doing the end work, which is create something that they can sustain them being able to be independent, they will remain on your shelter. So the Empowerment Plan and Veronica with her heart was able to close that gap by bringing an opportunity for people that they're looked at as second generation. A second-class citizen, unfortunately, and be able to bring them back and show that they are good people with good heart. If they get the opportunity and they get the training, that they will become back independent and they can do the good work. This is the population, the homeless population we're talking about. And there is, like I said earlier, there's people who are stuck in alcohol and drugs, and without fixing the issue as well, they will keep going and coming back. So that's why we do inpatient and outpatient treatment program to address those issues. Otherwise, people will keep. It will be a revolving door for homeless coming in and coming out, and we won't be able to fix the problem.
What I'm hearing from both of you is that you have to offer a lot of different services, that it has to be very holistic in order to address these big gaps when we're talking about things like mental health,
Yes.
domestic violence. What, for each of you, tell me what are some of the biggest challenges of being service providers in this sphere of homelessness and housing?
I'll chime in really quick. I think for me that there's a lot that you are making up for. You know, if somebody maybe went through school and nobody really saw that they were functionally illiterate, and that became a future barrier for many jobs that they really didn't understand. And that's something where we uncover later as they're an adult, and that has been holding them back for a long time. And, you know, somebody addressing these root issues of a lot of challenges as soon as possible is how we can really move the needle. But I think for us, you know, we have to do so much. And I think that's why the partnerships are so critical. It's like I wouldn't know the first thing about teaching a GED class. That is incredibly hard. Yeah. I don't know if I'd pass these days. Like exactly. I went to art school, so I don't know if the math section is something I could do. And I don't think people recognize how hard it is to get your GED, how much motivation you have to even get into a shelter and do those programs and do the things that will help you get to the next level. It is hard. And it shows a lot of dedication, a lot of motivation to even be there and to do those things. So for me, it's those, how can we not keep reinventing the wheel? How can there be specific partnerships where we all get to do what we're best at? Like, you know, how can we help Detroit Rescue Mission Ministries provide as much shelter as possible, and that we can hire as many people as possible from them that may have been repeatedly coming back on over and over again, so that we can free up a bed for somebody else. And that continuum keeps moving through so that we can really help people not get stuck in any one spot, and that we all can really play a role in that ecosystem of care and that social safety net, which is so important.
Yeah, Chad?
I think I'm going to be a little bit controversial and being honest about this whole thing.
Please bring the controversy.
I think the government is a big barrier for us to do the work right, because most elected officials are not really looking to end homelessness like they claim to be. Instead, they're trying to reduce the number by showing an altered kind of reports to show that they're doing good through their terms to reduce the number of homelessness. So they make a lot of changes without fixing the problem. We'll start by one. Recently, they changed the definition of homelessness, for example. So what does that mean? So if a person came out of prison, doesn't have no place to go, is he a homeless or not homeless? They say for the last 90 days, he had a known address. It was the jail or the prison. So he's no longer, or she's no longer homeless.
Wow.
So they cannot benefit from the service homeless solution dollars. Another example, somebody felt like I need to address my problem and I need to go to inpatient treatment program and I don't have no place to go, and my parents had got rid of me for many reasons, and now I hit the bottom and I need to go back. Now he goes or she goes to inpatient treatment program for 90 days. And they come back and they don't have no place to go. You can't use the shelter. You can't use any voucher. Why? Because you're not homeless. You had a place, which is a treatment program, that is a inpatient program. So you had a known address for the last 90 days. Those are elements to take the numbers of homeless down where they still exist. Another one, for the veterans, for example. The veterans, they have so many vouchers, and they tell the people, they offer the veteran a voucher to go, and he feels, I'm not ready yet to be independent, and I don't want to go to my own place. So he denied the voucher because he's not ready to be independent. So they said he voluntarily denied the voucher. He's no longer a homeless person. Well, is he homeless or is he not homeless? So those are things that are barriers, because when that person tried to take the first step of benefiting from what is available there for the homeless population, he's no longer qualified for homeless service. So therefore, we would have to go out. We as an organization, we would have to think outside the box on how can we still service that person without reporting them as a homeless person. And then we get slapped on the hand if we take that person in and try to help them under the homeless and report them that you're servicing somebody and you're taking a bed away from somebody who's homeless. So it is a lot of issues that is happening, becoming a big barrier for us. The question is, what is the solution?
Veronica.
The solution is we still have to press on. We still have to do the work. And me personally, I've been with Detroit Rescue Mission for the last 28 years. Wow. We do what needs to be done, and I really don't care what the government and anybody else says. I just meet the need, and then find partners like Veronica, for example, or other that we can work with and make sure we address the need as it arises every single day.
I mean, I think the industry, the community there needs a little bit of a rebel spirit like that, Audie. And Veronica, you had something to say as well?
To Chad's point, I describe it as a game of cups. You are hiding numbers and hiding people. And that has a powerful effect. Not only does it make their job so much harder to serve people, but it also changes how much money we get as a state, as a city. It affects everything.
Veronica Scott is the founder of Empowerment Plan. It employs people experiencing homelessness and offers them ways to carve paths out of poverty. And Chad Audie is the president of the Detroit Rescue Mission Ministries.
Metro. Tune in for all the best stories of the week and the ones you missed, the ones you need to hear again. And on Monday, we're going to take you out to the ball game.
Indeed, we are. That is right, Robin. The Detroit Tigers season is on the horizon. Spring training begins this weekend, so we're going to warm up and look back. Producer Jack Philbrandt has been working on a conversation that we're going to bring you Monday, and he joins us now in studio to fill us in. Hello, Jack.
Robin and Tia, how are you guys doing?
Hello.
You know, I was going to say, well, I'm all right. Burr, it's cold.
It is cold, but spring training is here. And I'm thinking the Tigers are going to be hot this season. That's me.
Tell us more.
Exactly, because when they say last season when it ended, they were on a streak. They were on a heater.
They were, and that moment meant so much to me. Throughout the entire Tigers postseason, I was glued to my TV. I had my rally cap on. I was screaming at my TV. I know my neighbors could definitely hear me. But on Monday, we want to hear about your experience with the Tigers, what the Tigers mean to you. And one of the best ways to do that is on the WDET mobile app. Open the app, go to the bottom right-hand corner, hit our open mic, and let us know what the Tigers mean to you.
And I just want to say, Robin, are you excited about the Tigers' upcoming season?
I am, and I also want to say I wouldn't be here if not for the Tigers. I'll explain more on Monday.
Oh, yes. Stay tuned for that special story on Monday. But, Jack, before we let you go, give that out one more time, the Open Mic app.
Yeah, go to our WDET mobile app. In the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see the Open Mic button. Click the button, a little microphone will pop up, and you can talk right into that and send us what the Tigers mean to you.
Jack Philbrandt is the producer for the Metro. As always, thank you, Jack, and we really look forward to talking about the Tigers Monday.
Thank you. Go Tigers.
Woo!
This is WDET-FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation.